Hi everybody, my name is Steve Polston, and this podcast is for fine art photography students, especially at the advanced level and beyond. This episode of Fine Art Photography will introduce you to David Nickel, a fine art creator with decades of experience as a conceptual designer and curator. David, welcome. I think as we discuss communication today, students will glean how important it is to connect with their passion in art creation and begin to think about how to use their skills and connection to their art to bring force to their projects, whether they are ready to exhibit, publish, or defend their theses.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be with you and everyone today. And an artist is a very broad term for me.
I enjoy that you say that it's a very broad term for you because as I know you, I find that you have expertise in so many different forms of art as well as in communication. And one thing that I always try to encourage my students to think about is narrative when they're creating art, because communication involves an understanding of who you are and where you want to go with your work, and also what it is that you're doing with it. Hopefully, students are always in control of what they're communicating. So, David, I wanted to ask you about your work in art, and this may feel like you are going in the Wayback Time machine, but I will tell you, you're not alone, because when I think about my involvement in art, particularly photography, because that's my passion, I think, this has been going on most of my life, even before I began carrying a camera with me for the sake of art and for producing art on a regular basis. Somewhere in the back of my psyche was this drive to create with photography. I had some sort of need. Tell me about your first artwork as a student artist.
Well, for me, it also goes way back to when I was young. I always knew that I was going to be an artist. My family knew I was going to be an artist. That's what I did, and that's how I saw my life going. Over the years, though, I've evolved into being exposed to so many different types of art and creative endeavors that to say that I'm currently using one modality of art is a misnomer. A few years ago, I took on the idea that I was a conceptual designer because I could conceptualize all sorts of things, including, photography and curating exhibits and paintings and graphic designs, that sort of thing.
I enjoy that you are talking about changing direction, and you are changing direction after many years of doing art and communication in a lot of different modalities. And when you decide that, hey, I should be working in art in a different direction than I have been, was there any sense of grief that you were stopping one track in your life, or was there just kind of joy about starting over and doing something different?
I never felt like I was starting over or doing something different, and I never felt sad about it, because for me it was a stepping stone, and I was getting exposed to different things, different ideas, different techniques, different mediums. And at one point I thought I would want to be an architect till I decided I didn't want to draw wall plates and electric grids in a hospital or something. Those kinds of things just move me to edit and say, this I like more than this, and I like this better than this, and that's how the evolution has gone for me.
I really appreciate that you talk about editing and doing this thing more than that and enjoying that thing more than the other thing, because when we are communicating with art, we're making choices, right?
Yes.
And some of those choices are innately part of our personality and our training, but then they also are intuitive, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that we can look at something that we're creating and take that deep breath for a moment and say, oh, well, of course, this isn't working because I'm not invested in it? Does that happen to you?
Yes. And a lot of times, too, over my years, it's been, okay, how can I make money doing this? How can I earn a living? And so I can do that for a while with a certain medium, and then it's not enough. And so I move on to something else that is much more rewarding and fits my dreams and my creativity.
Yeah, I can understanding of what you're able to create because you have such a broad experience. I want to go back to this idea of what you were creating as a young artist, because I visited your studio at your home one day, and in this nook inside your house where you're working, and I also see you in Zoom videos occasionally. On the wall, there's a couple of drawings, and I believe they're pencil drawings of figure drawings, women. And I look at those and I think, okay, these are classic drawings that any art student would recognize throughout the last 2,000 years of art. This is academic. This is academy work, right?
Yes.
And it's to me, it's intriguing because even though it is what we basically encounter when we are entering art school, even if we are there for photography, we don't start off doing photography. We start off drawing a lot of times and creating art with our eyes and our fingers and with paper. Those drawings I see in your studio at home are from what period of your life, young man?
Well, those were the mid 70s, so
Okay.
quite a while ago when I was in attending art school in Chicago at the American Academy of Art. Those are my life drawing projects. And figure drawings were always very scary for me. In the past, I was always connected to photography or relied on photographs as references for drawing. But in this class, you're drawing from life. These are real life models, and you're looking at them from your point of view only, not from any other student point of view, with specific lighting for where you are, and you have to draw it that way. And it was remarkable, and I loved it, and I learned so much about drawing. The days in art school were all-day classes, and the first half of the day was all life drawing, and those models would be up on their stage, either we started out with gesture drawings, where they would move like every 5 seconds, and you just had a few moments to try to touch as many points on that figure as you could. So those were just squiggles. But over time, they got more accurate, more scaled, more proportioned. And then the second half of that period, they would pose and for 15 minutes. And we would start making our formal, detailed drawings in charcoal. And they would stop after 15 minutes, take a break, have a cigarette, whatever. We'd take a break, come back. They'd get in the same position, almost the same position. And if they were way out of position, we would correct them and say, no, move your hand up your thigh a little bit to match what we were drawing. And is a very fascinating process.
That process of continuity is something that you use to.
It wasn't for me because I think a few years earlier, a very wise art teacher from probably junior high school said, you have to remember that Picasso learned how to draw before he was Picasso. So what we know of Picasso's, abstract, unrealistic representation is not what he was taught. His early works were very academic, very precise, photographic, basically, when we're trying for that. And through that process, if you learn that, then you can go into a different style. Me, that training and working on those core fundamentals of lighting or seeing color, seeing reflections, all those things influenced me much later when I was doing my own art or directing others, or how I would set up different projects. Or it really made a difference because I was looking for different things. In Chicago for 3 years. I had been doing commercial art and graphic designing, illustrating before that. My idea to go to the American Academy of Art was because I wanted to really get into the design center in Pasadena, and I knew I didn't have the skills to get in there. My portfolio wasn't ready, so my idea was to get a portfolio together over 2 years and then apply to go to the design center. Looking back on what I think I expected from Pasadena was that Pasadena was a conceptual design school. They were doing concept car designs. They were doing all these artistic things, but through a conceptual point of view, and coming up with something that I think appealed to me. But at the same time, they were very realistic and their illustrations were photographic. And early on, that was my style. I liked very precise, photographic-looking paintings, and that was my motivation. That got corrected a little bit when I took stagecraft in high school. And my teacher, I'm working on a 10-foot panel for a backdrop, and my teacher grabs my arm and he starts throwing it up and down. He said, "You cannot paint this panel from your wrist. You must use your shoulder to cover that space and to get those movements and that sort of thing." And that started me on a path of loosening up. I got more interested in Impressionist art and what you see from a distance and how your eyes will blend colors as you look at it. So that just took me in a different direction. It needed that little kickstart of going, you cannot draw from your wrist.
I enjoy that.
So a little background: after I left art school, was a graphic designer and illustrator for publications and magazines, and I worked out of Denver doing that, Michigan. I had clients in California, and then eventually I moved out with one of my clients to California. And the work wasn't enough to pay for living in California, so I got a job at a department store and shortly got recruited to do visual merchandising and displays because they knew that I was artistic and creative. And then that took me on about a 25-year career in displays, retail, visual merchandising stuff. And I did that for department stores for quite a while, let's say 8-10 years.
So visual merchandising in a department store, does that often translate into street level window displays?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay, that's classic.
Yeah, it was classic. One of the stores I had was downtown Los Angeles. We had 17 windows on the street.
Oh my goodness.
And, it was one of those old department stores, 9 floors, and,
That's a lot of pressure.
full merchandise, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And I loved it. And I worked my way into the corporate offices as a corporate director for visual merchandising. We opened all kinds of new stores, and things changed about every 3 to 4 weeks. And I liked that. I liked that you had to do something different. And it didn't look the same all the time. And you could do a Ralph Lauren style, or you could do abstract Japanese, or it could be country European, or it could be Renaissance influenced. All those things. That was a great career for me. And also being a little ADHD, I could keep doing things because it was always changing. And you finished it, but you had to take it down and do it all over again. So there was very little tangible things that you could say, this is my artwork.
Oh, yeah.
Here's my photograph. Here's my painting. Whatever.
Sure,
Didn't give you that.
We look at artwork as something permanent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about making art that dies.
Yeah.
And it dies at the hand of the creator, which
Mm-hmm.
is, a lot of us who create flat art, we think, oh, don't kill my babies.
Mm-hmm.
Don't edit that. Don't destroy that. Let's preserve it. And talking about working in the ether in some way.
Because I was inspired by the initial impact and how the viewer was influenced and impacted by my work. And that's what drove me to do it differently and better and so on and so forth.
How do you create better and keep changing and at the same time doing what I think must be maddening for the marketing folks who are trying to sell season? And are they...
They're the ones that are driving, a trend or an influencer. That's what you translate into a physical world that they might be doing with photography for their catalogs or billboards and things like that. You have to bring that into a dimensional retail store experience that's viewed from various points of view.
Who has the mind's eye at that point? Is it the set designer, or the marketing department? Who's the creative there that is making something, a scene that's appropriate for a season?
I was fortunate to work with some super talented people, and the marketing people were mostly driven by a product. Then the retail design, visual merchandising directors would come up with the concepts to say, how can we move that to a whole new level and bring it into an experiential level that will draw people into your stores, convince them to buy something that they might not want to buy or expected to buy, all that sort of thing.
So the psychology of suggestion, I think, must be very strong in visual product display and in the story that you're involving the customer in.
And the other thing, we had to learn how to animate a product somehow, that it wasn't just a static thing, that you were visually seeing something animated in a way.
So animated on a life form, like a...
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Sometimes we would just take, clothing and stuff it with tissue or neckties and wire them and make it look like they're blowing in the
Scarecrows.
wind. Yes. So learning how to do that relied on what I learned in art school and life drawing about what's anatomically correct. Where does that elbow bend? And what can it do and what can't it do? So everything went back to those very fundamental trainings. I paid particular attention to lighting the displays and how that affects something. And I was influenced so often by photographers, really well-known, famous photographers, and what they do and what they are creating in a still photograph and what they were relying on as a fundamental with light, color,
Sure.
form, all that.
I'm so glad
Yes.
that you mentioned that. Emotion sells products, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It absolutely does. And in windows, display windows in particular, where it's a box and you have much more control of building the set around it and using the lighting. If you took a picture of it, it would hold together and you wouldn't see all the parts and,
Well, that window has its own resolve in it, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You have a window that's successful if someone stops to look, but if someone walks by and glances and keeps walking, then maybe
Better redo it.
you better redo it. Yeah. I think of how wonderful it is as an introvert to stop and look at something and to really regard and meditate what it is that's being said in the artwork. And now you've allowed me to understand that visual presentation in a department store, for instance, in Los Angeles at street level, has the same work that has to be put into fine art photography. I create medium format film photography on the street that requires me to meditate before I punch the shutter. It's a heavy machine that creates a big clunk, and then I advance the film when I take out the dark slide and advance it, reset the mirror and the shutter, put the dark slide in again. All these things you have to do to create one image in medium format photography. And so it's not that I am concerned so much about wasting film, because really when you're creating an artwork for presentation, you're going to print it, mount it, glaze it, frame it, hang it on a wall, hopefully sell it at some point. You're putting all this effort in, and still not the most expensive proposition of creating artwork. So I don't mind so much of burning some film. But I do want to meditate on what I'm seeing, and even though I'm shooting street level photography to document, let's say, the front of a building, I'm thinking about form and how I'm connecting with that. And when you speak about creating a storefront window, I'm thinking about you're meditating when you're...
That process took weeks. Sometimes we would work a month ahead, developing what we wanted it to look like. And what has always amazed me about photography, and good photographers who know when to hit that shutter button, I can't believe it, what they capture at that moment. But I know that they've been training their eyes. And I'm guessing that when you found a subject that you want to photograph, you might have looked at that subject for several days or weeks and thinking, okay, today's lighting is not right. The sun's not where it's supposed to be, or there's a truck parked in front of that building. There's all those restrictions, but it amazes me how to get the pictures that are being produced by some of these photographers who just hit the button right. On the other hand, a number of years ago, I worked for 3 years for a fine art photographer, And she was a master at photoshopping. Amazing what she could maneuver and cut from this picture and move to that picture, to build the end result. It was unbelievable.
That is amazing to consider because I don't work that way at all. And a lot of it has to do with not having the patience to do that level of fine detail and creativity. It's enough for me to regard a scene and look for space and shape and color and light, shadow, but then to think of someone who actually is conceiving of something that is not actually there and then bringing it in to make it there, that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
What did you learn about communication when you were working with that photographer? And I remember that you presented her work also as a solo show.
Yes. She would often have a concept of, she did a lot of celebrity photo shoots, and for their personal and private use only. It wasn't for magazines or publications, anything. It was just their personal.
So commission
Work, yes. And so oftentimes she would want to put them into some sort of fantasy type of setting. I remember one photo shoot in particular, we were doing a Christmas card with a family, and she wanted it to have a Western theme with Indian teepees in the background, horses, all sorts of stuff like that out in the country. It was shot during the day. It ended up, the final photograph had a sunset with a moon coming up over the trees that weren't there. The younger kids weren't behaving. So, one good shot from this slide, that kid got moved into this setting, into the other. And her and I worked really well at making sure that what we saw, the light, was looking very realistic, and that she captured that one shot, which took, days and hours to do.
What is it that means so much when an artist is communicating? What are you looking for, let's say, as a curator? I know you've put together some shows. Tell me about those shows and what you're looking for when you are gathering art from multiple sources or from a solo artist.
Yeah. I've curated exhibits that included sculpture, drawing, painting, photography, all sorts of things. And that process kind of starts with, what story do you need to tell? What's the flow? What's the concept really behind that exhibit? And what do you want to showcase about this artist? And it's a lot of editing and arranging. I remember the show that you and I worked on, how we maneuvered it because the artwork would have been great blown up. It was a 3 foot by 3 foot, very dramatic, very colorful, but someone coming to the exhibit could just stand at the front door, look around the room, and think that they've seen the show, and they hadn't. So I wanted to force the viewer to come look at the art, and your direction to do the prints very small made that possible. And the way I arranged them so that you couldn't see them all until you went up and looked at it, it slowed you down. It made you look at what you were supposed to look at.
I think that was a really good way of using communication to bring the viewer into the creative space where I was working as the photographer.
And that idea, that concept came from my visual merchandising background of how you put displays into a store and how you can maneuver and manipulate a viewer.
That's good. I think that's a really good way of tying together this idea of communication. Visual artists, and especially my photography students, have to think about what it is they're communicating and on what levels, and even so much as what is a narrative. Being in control of that moment is what sets the lucky camera operator apart from the artist, is being able to have a working model in mind before beginning and creating according to that purpose.
I've always felt that a fine artist who is either drawing, painting, sculpting, whatever, had it a lot easier than a photographer, because a photographer shoots what they shoot and that's what you get, where an artist could paint something, adjust it a little bit, change the shape, change the mood, change the coloring just by the medium that they're working with. They get intentional about that because they're not limited to photography and inanimate objects getting on that film.
Right. There's some, we've covered a lot of territory, but there's some streets I want to drive down for a minute. If you would tell me what you were creating for Epcot.
So after I left retail display work, I got into designing for manufacturers who made props for retailers, display fixturing for merchandising, decorative props. So the company that I worked for in Denver was one of the largest companies to do Christmas decorations. They had a big crew, a big factory, 150 employees, so on and so forth. But they were only busy from like August to November. And they had all this talent and skill in working with all these materials. We made artificial Christmas trees and Christmas decorations for retail stores and for malls and for theme parks. And so I was designing for those projects. So when Disney approached me, they'd go, okay, we need a 40-foot Christmas tree for the Contemporary Hotel. We need Christmas decorations in all the retail shops throughout Epcot. So in the British land, the China store, it had its own theme that I had to design for. When you get into one of the other lands or space land, you have to design for that. So that's how I got into, all the Disney properties in Florida and also in Los Angeles.
It's incredible to me that you're talking about making industry scale Christmas decorations.
Mm-hmm.
And for you, it's a process of communication and manufacturing finesse and knowing what will work
Right.
and how to draw it.
Yep.
So it will work, and also communicating with marketing folks at Epcot or Disney who want you to populate marketing furniture for
Yes.
their sales floors. You're creating Christmas, dude.
Yes.
And so many of us don't ever consider that Christmas is something that is a manufactured reality in so many ways. Certainly we have a spiritual sense,
Mm-hmm.
probably given to us by our parents, and what our wishes are and dreams and our spiritual fulfillment. But what we encounter, though, is in the marketplace, isn't it?
Yes. I'm sure most people have seen my work somewhere. And, I worked with all the major retailers doing Christmas decorations and then non-seasonal, non-Christmas decorations too. And like I remember one of the big projects, well, we did Christmas for all the Bloomingdale stores. And they wanted to set up Christmas all the same night. So we ended up sending out about 75 semi-trailer loads of pre-decorated, pre-lit Christmas trees that they could pull out of the truck, run and set it on a ledge, plug it in, and it was done. And, we're doing hundreds of trees, different sizes, everything like that. Then they also came to me for another project where they wanted to do an Italian theme look, because they had just remodeled their theater in New York at the Bloomingdale store, and they wanted to open the theater with a Fellini film that had never been seen. And Fellini wouldn't release it. But one of the executives knew a friend of Fellini's who had published at one time a small book of Italian products. And so they made a deal with her. We will republish your book. We will replicate these images, these classic Italian products, if you convince Fellini to release the film. So they came to me because I had done some other projects with this technique, and we ended up making these large paper, they weren't paper, but they looked like Japanese paper lanterns of these products. So we had a life-size Vespa, we had a 14-foot gondola, we had a 6-foot diameter fedora, we had 6-foot tall elbow macaronis, coffee espresso makers, all of that stuff.
The circus of a Fellini film
Yeah.
is right there in front of me.
So, and that was going to 40 stores, all those things. And what I enjoyed working collaboratively with the Bloomingdale's people was that when you think about Italy or Fellini, these products, you don't think about Japanese lanterns, paper lanterns. And so there's this juxtaposition that elevates the whole idea, the whimsy of it, just because they don't seem relatable.
I like that you say the word passion, and then you tie that to form. And that's what I want my fine art photography students to remember when they are assembling their work for presentation, whether it's in a thesis or a small project or for a display or a solo art show, that they always have to think about the medium they're working with and how it communicates about their processes. Because after all, that's when we tell people what we believe about our artwork. When we show someone our collection of photographs, or even just one, we are saying, this is what I believe photography does. Photography does this. Those things that we command in our performance of photography are the statement that we're making about the art form, don't you think?
I think so. And I think you're also communicating what your eye sees that other eyes don't see in the world. And what you see, you're capturing in film, and then introducing it then to a wider audience who wouldn't normally see what you just saw. And, inspire them, or, give them joy or fear or whatever, because their eyes didn't see it, and your artist eye saw it.
Very good. That's a nice way to end, I think, too, David. I appreciate all of the time you've spent with me today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure too. It's also nice that for the first time in 12 or 13 years, we've been able to speak for such a long time about photography
Mm-hmm.
and art. We don't often get a chance
No.
to really talk in depth, and I appreciate the ways in which you've mentored me and to help me learn about your processes of seeing and communication, which I've always admired the product that you create when you are assembling a project, but it's nice to know about the personal history you have with art and in your career, and I think it's a very valuable perspective, obviously, for students to know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, David.